Hello, everyone. My name is Philip Palumbo. I'm the host of the Palumbo podcast, where we interview some of the most successful founders of businesses to learn how they got to the top. Today, we have with us Mark Dhooge. Mark Dhooge is a leader who has spent over 3 decades transforming the lives of South Florida's most vulnerable children and families. As president and CEO of Kids in Distress since 1994, Mark has grown this community-based nonprofit into a $40 million organization that serves as a lifeline for children. Mark's impact doesn't stop there. Since 2019, he's also served as president and CEO of Family Central Inc., another cornerstone organization founded in 1971 that focuses on comprehensive family strengthening and early learning programs throughout South Florida. Under his dual leadership, these organizations provide everything from maternal health services and behavioral counseling to foster care, licensing, and early childhood education. Today, we'll dive into Mark's leadership philosophy, discuss the challenges of running two major nonprofits simultaneously, and explore how his unique background in law enforcement and direct care has shaped his approach to organizational leadership and community impact. So, Mark, welcome to the show, and we're grateful to have you here.
Phil, very much welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and listen, congratulations on all your success too. And really, the first question I'll ask you is, this is not just your typical, profit business that you've been running for really your entire career. So I just want to start with, how did you even get into this business or nonprofit that you're in today?
Well, my story is quite interesting. You mentioned that I had a law enforcement background very early on in my human service career. My undergrad is actually in criminal justice, conservation, and biology. Quite honestly, I thought I was going to save the rhinos. I thought I was going to save animals. Didn't have that opportunity coming out of college, so I actually was a deputy sheriff for the Marquette County Sheriff's Department up in Michigan. And I did that work for about 2 years. But what I found as a very young cop is that I was putting a lot of juvenile kids into detention centers. I worked in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We'd send those kids downstate into locked facilities. Unfortunately, when they came back to us, they were worse off than when we sent them away, gang affiliated, drug affiliated. So at that point, that was in 1992, 1991, 1992, I actually quit my job as a law enforcement officer and moved into a Boys Town group home with the same kids that we were integrating back into our community. And that kind of set the stage for my entire career of trying to go upstream. How do we prevent juvenile justice type of incidents? How do we prevent child abuse? Really trying to go upstream with a philosophy, and how do we provide treatment, support, encouragement, inspiration to kids before they get into trouble?
Wow, that's is this something you always thought about, or just happened to be because you had the exposure as you did?
And, the catalyst was really when I was a young cop. I was 21 years old on the street, and I don't want to say befriended, but I gained a lot of trust from a lot of the teenagers in town. And, unfortunately, they told me a lot of things. You end up, doing arrests and things like that. But I realized very early on that was not the solution. The solution was really providing the trust, the relationship, the mentorship that these kids needed. So they didn't get in trouble in the first place. And, after that career, I did that for a couple of years, lived with those kids, and then had the opportunity to, I got a national award in San Antonio for some of that work, but had the opportunity to meet the folks at Kids in Distress down here in Fort Lauderdale. And it didn't take me very long to know that they were working with young children between the ages of birth and 12. And that's where my prevention philosophy really took off, is that I'm a firm believer that early intervention is prevention. If we can intervene with children and families, when they're young, birth to 5 is really when brain development, when social interaction takes place. That's where we need to focus on. So I moved down to Florida in 1994, and correct you a little bit. I haven't been the CEO since 1994. I've been in this role for about 14 years, but I've occupied just about every position coming to Kids in Distress as a foster parent, and doing that work for a couple of years first, and then pretty much engaging in every position up the chain until I've been in my current position.
So within your current position, so did you start this nonprofit organization?
I did not. Our nonprofit, Kids in Distress, has been in existence since 1980. Kids in Distress, Family Central since 1971. So when I joined, we had about 45 employees. We were impacting probably about 200 to 400 kids annually. We've grown into a $40 million organization, nearly 350 employees, impacting about 20,000 children annually.
So this is what you've been doing essentially your entire career, besides the 2 years, like you just said before, were you in police, et cetera. In terms of from a business perspective, right? How do you think about this? I want to get into all the detail of what you do and what the nonprofit does, but from a business perspective, how do you think about this? And do you think about this nonprofit as any other business, or there's some different nuances that you have to be aware of?
Phil, that's a great question. Why? Because, we are a nonprofit. We're a, not-for-profit entity in the business world. A lot of people feel that designation means that we're able to just accept donations, which it does. That gives us that, that ability to accept donations, accept contributions. We raise about $4 million annually through private donations, special events, foundation requests, those kind of things. But the misnomer for nonprofits is that many people feel that a nonprofit organization is not truly a business. And that's probably because there are so many nonprofits out there, many of which, 90% of nonprofits are under a $500,000 budget. But the reality is, once you start to get into a nonprofit that has more than $1 million budget, all of the same principles and then some are required. As a matter of fact, we have to undergo an annual audit of all of our financials, our balance sheets, our assets, all of the donations that come in, including $1 million worth of in-kind donations, which are donations such as clothing, food, and toys, but also include service type of donations. So the requirements for a nonprofit oftentimes are more than in the enterprise world. But truly, the way that I have a chief financial officer, I have a chief operations officer, I have a VP of HR, that has to go through all the health and screening of all of our employees before they come in. So from a business aspect, we're probably scrutinized more than a for-profit business is in our community.
Sounds like a publicly traded company in a way, right? In terms of the scrutinization.
Yeah, I think the major difference is that in the nonprofit world, any profit that we might make at the end of the year is 100% reinvested back into the mission. That's probably one of the designations that really sets us, apart. We don't have shareholders. Our board of directors are all volunteer. We have 25 board of directors. They don't share in that profit. They're all volunteer and give from their heart. As a matter of fact, we have a give-get policy, meaning they don't. Not only do they not get profit from the organization, we have a give-get policy where they have to give a minimum of $6,000 annually from their personal assets or from their business to be affiliated with our board of directors.
So with the nonprofit, as you think about it from a business perspective, so you raise $4 million per year. So is that almost like that's your revenue for the nonprofit on an annual basis?
Great question. That's the revenue that we have to raise, which does not cover the gap in the contracts that we have with government sources. For example, we contract with our local entities, the Children's Services Council of Broward County, the Children's Trust out in Miami-Dade, state entities like the Department of Children and Families, as well as folks like HHS at the feds. We're also a Medicaid provider. So the majority of our $40 million budget really comes from public sources, but a variety of them. Local, state, and federal sources of income. That $4 million that we raise and our organizations is really utilized to fill those gaps, to raise the bar to excellence for the type of expenditures that our government contracts do not cover.
So this $40 million budget number that you're explaining to me, that's what exactly?
That's a combination of the 80% or so of income that we get from state, federal, and local sources, including Medicaid revenue, the contributions that I advised to you, as well as some earned income that we have with kind of private ventures that we've engaged upon. A good example of that is that we have a dental clinic on our campus that is operated in collaboration with Nova Southeastern University. It fills a gap for our underprivileged kids that would not be able to access dental services on on their own, but we actually received rental services because we built out this dental clinic in 2009 from Nova Southeastern for the privilege of using our space, using our equipment, as well as the referral of about 2,000 kids to ensure that their students can have a practice, through their educational experience.
So the $40 million is what's used throughout the year to run the business and everything, all the great things that you guys do for the kids.
Correct. And it also includes staff salaries, utilities, anything that would require a normal business to operate.
Exactly. So you as a CEO of the nonprofit, what's your day-to-day like?
I'm a big believer in servant leadership. So I would say that 80% of my time is really spent being here for our team. You could come into our campus, and I do many, many tours, in a week, in a month. And people come to our campus and they feel sometimes like it's Disney World. We have a beautiful campus, well taken care of, but I am quick to let them know that our campus and our properties are not our greatest asset. It really is our people. I have a leadership team that I'm so incredibly proud of because although I've been with the organization 32 years, our average leadership tenure is about 20 years.
Wow.
So many of the folks were, for instance, BSW or Bachelor of Social Work students of mine back in the early 2000s. And, our greatest asset is by far our people. We have an incredible culture, a culture of support, a culture of championing our team members, giving our team members opportunity for not only advancement in the organization, but also opportunity to engage in their local community, to ensure that the prongs of our mission are well spread throughout South Florida.
So you mentioned your people is your biggest asset, which I totally agree with. I say it all the time, whether it's a CEO or management, whether it's public company, private, or whatever it may be. People is everything. It drives everything as it relates to a business. But you as the CEO is an important driver of that. So what do you do as you think about leadership to make sure you drive your employees and the other leadership and the leadership team to make sure they're operating on all cylinders?
I think you start with orientation. I'm a big believer in that. One of the most important parts of my role is to meet every employee that comes in the front door on during the first week that they're here. So we hold an orientation. That's an all-day orientation. I spend the first 2 to 2.5 hours with those new team members to share the vision, the mission, our leadership philosophy with them. Secondly, something that I advise every team member is that I have an open door policy. I tell folks that, it doesn't matter if an open door policy means, yes, my office, but it also means that I hold open Zoom office hours where my Zoom is completely open, because much of what we do is community based, which means some of our team members spend 80% of their time out in the community, not in an office or a campus-based environment. So I make myself available on a one-to-one basis for them throughout the week during those Zoom office hours. But I also give every single employee my cell phone. I give every single employee my Instagram messaging account. They can contact me any way they possibly can, not only if they have questions, concerns, or challenges, but also to share in the good work that they're doing. I let them know that, yes, I want to hear those challenges, but it's equally important for us as a team to celebrate the wins that they make, the difference that they make, and the impact they make with children and families. So, that's one of the big philosophies that I have. I'm a huge follower of General Colin Powell, who one of his leadership philosophies was to do what he called walkabouts. So I schedule time within my calendar every single week to do walkabouts, to walk through our campus and just meet with our people, make sure I get to know them, but most importantly, to provide them with inspiration and share with them the stories of other folks within our team members that are making a difference in the community and that are also celebrating their wins.
I love that. I love the Colin Powell walkabouts. That stuff is so important to stay connected with your employees. I don't probably spend enough time doing that. I really should spend even more time. And the thing is, and I think this as a CEO, it's, you really have to time block and just making sure because if you don't put it in your calendar, it's never going to get done. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. My calendar is, I squeeze, I would say probably 40% to 50% of my calendar is ensuring that I'm spending time, with our people. But that also includes the direct supervision of my executive team, the CFO, the VP of advancement, VP of HR, or my COO. I make sure that I spend at least an hour of personal time with them one-on-one every single week. Do they need that? Probably not to do their job. Most of them are very flexible, and I give them the freedom to make decisions on their own. But I want to be there as a support, and I also want to be there as an encourager. That to me is so incredibly important. I know, over time, I also believe that managing yourself out of a position and being able to champion your folks, being able to encourage them, as well as give them the leeway to make decisions on their own, is something that's incredibly important, because that provides buy-in to the organization. I can't stand micromanagement. I feel that if you have to micromanage your employees, then those are employees that probably don't need to be here.
I totally agree with you. As it relates to meetings with your executive team or employees or the entire nonprofit organization, what does that look like?
That's a great question. We're different than a lot of nonprofits, and that actually changed during the pandemic, which hard to believe was almost 6 years ago, right? Is that, that was for many businesses, the pandemic was a challenge. But I was just talking to one of our board members the other day how important the pandemic actually strengthened our culture, because as many of us know, during times of tragedy, during times of stress and challenge, people come together. And that's exactly what happened with this organization, is that it was during the time, as a matter of fact, when we acquired Family Central. It was only a year after the Family Central acquisition that the pandemic kind of hit. And we immediately, almost 2 weeks into the pandemic, started weekly all-staff Zoom meetings. It was wonderful that technology was available, but we actually, even today, we still have monthly Zoom meetings. They're not weekly anymore, but it gave us the opportunity to not only communicate on a monthly basis and on a consistent basis, but to ensure that the needs, the needs of our team members were being met, that we were addressing any challenges immediately. And then through that, and actually once we had our Zoom meetings, we initiated what we called our a food distribution program very early on in the pandemic. Something that we don't really do in the organization. We partner with several organizations in the community, Feeding South Florida, Feeding America. But during the pandemic, we actually had those entities drop about 4,000 pounds of food in our parking lot. And then our team members brought food to families they serve. And we had also families that brought their cars in. But the reason I mention that is because it really solidified our culture and brought our team members together, knowing that we weren't just going to sit on our hands and sit at home during the pandemic. Our job is to make a difference with the children and families we serve. And we really launched an initiative that allowed us to continue that very important service, even though it's not something we do every single day. And that really brought our team members together in a lot of ways.
That's really excellent. In terms of measuring the business, so the nonprofit, so do you have KPIs that you utilize, as many of us do, to see how you're progressing and getting the word out there and the growth of the organization? What is that? How does that work exactly?
Yeah, KPIs are so important. We often look at them as outcomes, in the nonprofit world, outcomes for our team members. And we have KPIs, measured financially, measured in impact, in how much impact are we making in individual programs, as well as KPIs related to donor engagement, and how many donors are coming back to the table. Every single one of our programs has goals associated and outcomes associated with it, to make sure that there's a measurement tool based on whatever we're doing. For example, in our maternal health programs, we measure immunization rates. How many of our families are getting immunized? How many of them have a medical home? What are the developmental milestones that the children within our maternal health programs are making, and how are those compared to the norms? That's just one program. Every program that we have, and we have about 32 distinct programs, many of which are evidence-based, which means they have been longitudinally studied at the academic level to prove their efficacy and to prove their effectiveness. That's program level. On the financial side, we measure very specifically when donations come in, We have donor and stewardship personnel who measure how many contacts they make. They measure how success those contacts are over time, and then was there fulfillment in a donor that they contacted based on how much revenue came in or how much a contribution was made by that donor. So almost everything is measured in the nonprofit world, and much of that measurement is then articulated back to your funders and your donors to prove and to to keep your nonprofit status, that you're not in here making loads and loads of money, but you actually are reinvesting back into your mission.
Yeah, I'm such a big believer that what gets measured gets managed. That's such a big people really don't understand, right? And sometimes when you hire a coach, I see you're in great shape, and I like to do exercise and work out as well. But when you actually measure everything, it gets managed so much better. You get closer to your goals. When you don't, and you just kind of ad hoc about things, back of the envelope. I always say this all the time. You could be back of the envelope with financial planning as an example, right? Meaning that people say, hey, my number is $20 million. If I get to $20 million in assets, I can stop working, sell my business, whatever it may be. And that's kind of back of the envelope in their head. And I'm not saying you're not going to succeed by having back of the envelope, but what I am saying is that if you do take the time to truly measure things specifically, it will get managed much more accurately over time. And that's a significant difference. There are studies in my business that if you actually have a formal financial plan, your wealth will grow by 2x over your lifetime, which is a significant difference. So measuring everything, and not just your businesses, my businesses, but our personal lives, whether it's our spouses, children, our health, fitness, all that type of stuff, everything should be measured. And when you measure it, I really feel like it can be managed. And obviously you're doing the same and having tremendous success with that. Any comments regarding that?
Yeah, I could not agree more. And from a professional standpoint, and I'm so pleased that you mentioned a personal standpoint as well, is that I take a lot of my personal measurements into the business, because I am a firm believer in the fact that if you don't have a specific strategic plan or a blueprint or an outline for where you're heading and where you're going, right, with those measurements that you're talking about associated with that plan, then right, a lot of times you stay stagnant. And businesses that stay stagnant, even in the nonprofit world, are just destined to lose their following, to lose their their culture, and in my opinion, eventually fail.
What's really fascinating about this, and from my personal experience, is that when you measure something and you see the progress happening, that's the motivation behind you then to get to the next level, to the next level, and to the next level. But without measuring things and seeing it on paper and seeing where you were a month ago versus where you are today, I mean, it can't tell you how motivating it is. And that's really like, if people say, well, kind of back of the envelope's fine and my head's fine, but but what's the real benefit of doing that? That's the real benefit, is when you have it literally in writing, seeing where you were a month ago, a year ago, 2-3 years ago, and then seeing where you are today. That's such a motivating factor.
Absolutely.
So Mark, I want to dive into, now that we went through the business, I do want to dive into more about exactly the impact of a couple things, right? So I don't want to get into politics or anything like that. So the situation with Charlie Kirk that occurred with this young man who's 22, right? When you think about what provoked him to do what he did, and you think about your background and what you do you have any thoughts about that?
Interesting question, Bill.
To get to that, what makes somebody get to that level?
Interesting question. I feel I have very strong faith principles. I feel that, in that kind of situation, this young man was unfortunately who came from a great household, by the way. When you look at his parents and, they are two people that have given back to society for their whole careers. Is that without a whole lot of evidence, although some of it is coming out, I think that our young people are very swayed by either falsely stated materials or overly stated materials, that are available online. And that's not only the fear, a fear for politics, it's a fear in so many other social, societal issues. Right. We have, I'll use an example. My wife runs another nonprofit called Children's Harbor. Her young females are very, very indoctrinated online by the fact that you can access sex and sell it and make a whole lot of money very easily. That indoctrination of the internet, of radical type of folks that are out there, some of which might not even be folks anymore, right? With AI, you don't know what's true and true and what is from a thought leader, a human thought leader, and what might be generated from an entity that somebody just programmed in and wants you to sway you to a specific position. So I'm not sure. I think that, and again, in my opinion, this is something, this young man was probably, indoctrinated, with his involvement on social platforms, and I'm saying things away from Facebook and Instagram and things like that. But, on the dark web, there are a lot of different social platforms that actually rally around violence and rally around these, and I'm more in the middle when it comes to politics. I'm looking at the fringe. There's on the right side, there's fringe folks, and on the left side, there's fringe folks that really engage and indoctrinate behaviors and actions that are malicious in nature. So I think it's sad. I think that there has to be at some point some kind of, and I'm a free speech and I hate a gun-toting kind of person, what I mean? But the reality is at some point we have to get a handle on some of that material that's out there and who it's being, because folks are not, this young man was 22 years old. Right. Even in our world of social services, I have a 30-year-old, he was not a real adult until he's 25. He served in the military for 10 years, so he had to see some pretty significant things. Did several tours in Afghanistan before that time, but we have a firm belief, and there's a lot of studies that show that you don't really become a thought leader of somebody that can form adult type of decisions until you're 25 years old. Wow. So, not only is brain development so significant birth to 5, but it really continues until you're a 25-year-old. And I don't think from a society standpoint, a lot of us have gotten our arms around that real concept. Even though you can drink at 21, you can vote at 18, and just like my son, you can serve in the military at 18 years old. We have to realize that, the brain is still malleable and ideas are still malleable well into the early 20s.
Oh, that's really interesting. So to get into the kids that you serve, and when they come and they're faced with challenges and they do things that against that things that that should be doing. Oftentimes, like you said before, like 0 to 5 is really an important time, and I've heard this so many times, right, in someone's life. So everything in your view and from what you've seen and studied does go back to 0 to 5, or can go beyond that?
Well, it certainly can go beyond that. We believe in and it well studied in a concept called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, right? And ACEs is a well studied mental health, concept where, it's really based on 10 different actions that might occur with a child. Family divorce, abuse and neglect, sexual abuse, loss of a mother. A lot of things are associated with the 10 concept that are in ACEs. But the reason I bring that up is because the more childhood adversity that a child has in those younger years, the more apt they are to have developmental delays, to have cognitive delays, and most importantly, emotional delays that impact their ability to form healthy, bonded relationships with their peers or with adults. So yes, birth to 5 is incredibly important in laying that foundation for those children. But when you look at it, it's really all based on the parents. We work with 20,000 children, but oftentimes when people come in, many of our programs are designed to, teach a parent how to be their child's first teacher, to engage with a parent on what appropriate discipline is. You're not necessarily teaching a 2-year-old any kind of concept. You're really demonstrating and doing role plays with that parent on how to appropriately parent, on how to appropriately teach, on how to appropriately model. All of those things to ensure that the brain development at that very early age is the best that it possibly can be. And every study that I've ever come across, it's really those formative years that can make or break a child into how, and I hate to say how easy their life might be from then on, whether it's success in wealth, whether it's success in career, whether it's success socially, can really be looked at as a dependent on those birth to 5 years.
Right. So when you break this down, so let's say you have a child who's been faced with adversities, right? And so from your studies, what helps them the most to get away from that so they could quote unquote live a normal life and have just as much success versus somebody who was not faced with adversities or as many adversities.
Yep. I get that question a lot, Phil, a lot. And, the reality is it's not as hard a concept as you think it is. There's a quote out there that has been kind of spread out. It's used it. I wish I can remember who said this, but, every child is one carrying adult from being a success story. And that's reality. The reality is that kids don't need significant treatment. Yes, it's important, right? Mental health treatment. But if a child has just one mentor in their life, be that their parent, be that a neighbor, be it a coach or a relative, that one caring adult can really change the trajectory of that child's life forever. And so it's probably, when you look at studies, it's the most significant event that it can occur in a child's life is to have one person that cares about them, that believes in them, that gives them the opportunity to express themselves, that could really change that child from where they're. And for example, even in my own life, is that my ACEs score that I was referring to earlier is rather high. I have a 7 as an ACEs score, but I had very significant adult role models, primarily a coach in my life, who actually changed the trajectory and believed in me so much that I thought that I could be a professional NFL star at one point. You know what I mean? In my high school years. But, of course, that completely, I love what I'm doing now. But the reality is that person allowed me to believe in myself. And when you believe in yourself and you have that positive outlook, it really changes everything.
I tell you, Mark, if that is really that significant, that's an amazing message to get out there for people to say, okay, who can I help that needs guidance and mentorship? Because if that really makes that much a significant difference, I mean, I just think that's so powerful, especially the way you started to talk about it. I mean, that's tremendous.
Yeah, it's simplistic, but it's incredibly powerful. And that doesn't go with kids either, by the way. We work with a lot of adults, and sometimes when we work with families, we're the first person that has come into that family's life who's not scrutinizing them for mistakes that they made. And we believe in that. We believe in hope. We believe in compassion. We believe in positivity. We also believe in tenacity, though. We believe that you have to pull your bootstraps up, in order to get out of the situations that, where you might have made mistakes in your life. And that takes tenacity and it takes hard work. And you have to, we're not in the business of fixing people. I mean, that's not what we do. We're in the business of providing hope, encouragement. And if you want the education and the mentorship, we will be there, walking with you side by side.
What about those that maybe may not have an advantage of having a mentor, a coach, or parent to guide them through exactly what you just said? How hard is it for these people to fight through this on their own and then make it out the other side in a positive way?
I think it's incredibly challenging in a lot of ways. Why do I believe that? Because I've seen, where kids kind of, kind of reviewing what we've talked about, then they end up going into the internet. You know what I mean? They end up in, that's how gang affiliation works, as a matter of fact, is that, gangs become a family. They become the mentor. They become the person that cares about that child. And that indoctrination, is really the same as a family in a lot of ways. So it's just a matter of where do we direct, where do we direct this family? Where do we direct this individual to make sure that there's optimism and there's positivity, but most importantly, that there's hope, for who they can become in the future.
Yep, it's all about hope. As far as social media is concerned, right? So I just feel like the proliferation of it, and listen, I have 3 boys, 16, 13, and 11, and they have phones, etc. And we try to control it as much as we can. We do, I think, a pretty good job in doing that. But what is your view on social media, and where do we go with this disaster?
You mentioned the word proliferation, which I 100% believe in. Is that I believe that one of the huge issues and challenges with social media is that and I think what people, especially as parents, don't realize, it's incredibly addictive. As you know that it's it's so addictive that it probably transcends many of the drugs that we encounter. When people can't put down their phones, or you've seen as well when children are faced with disciplinary actions, because we're taking the social media away.
Right.
if they're tantruming and they're acting negative and they're throwing their phone around and they're getting aggressive, then we have come to a point in society where we've overlooked the importance of personal relationships and how incredible those personal relationships are. As you know, I'm sure, is that studies show as we age, the most important distinct dominant factor of whether longevity, which I'm a huge I stay in shape, because longevity is an issue for me. I want to be sure that I'm there for my grandchildren. But the one predominant factor to ensure longevity is healthy, mature, positive relationships. It's not how many times you go to the gym. It's not how many hours a week you walk. It's really based on those relationships. And it doesn't have to be 5 or 6. It might only be 2 or 3. But deep relationships are the most significant factor in a long, happy life.
Absolutely. It absolutely is. In terms of parents that are listening to this and everything that we talked about with adversity with kids, et cetera. So what is the number one or two things that parents can do for those who have younger children that are adolescents, teenagers, et cetera? What can we do to really be the best parents so our children can somewhat live, a very normal life and succeed and grow as best as they can?
Well, I came from a generation, but I'm an Xer, of course, where, I'd spend days and weeks in the woods, and didn't have a lot of parental involvement. I was more freedom to do what I want. I'm a pretty firm believer in that. No, you're not supposed to be a friend to your child, but engagement in your child's life from a very early age. I have a 30-year-old. I only had one son, but I'm a firm believer in that, the relationship development of getting away from the TV, having an experiential journey with your child. And when I say that, a lot of people say, oh yeah, take extravagant vacation. You don't have to take your child to Disney World, right? Fishing with your child, walking on the beach with your child, taking your child to a park and throwing a frisbee back and forth. I think we've lost some of that very basic relationship development actions and activities that parents would rather be on their phone. And if their child's on their phone, then the child is being pacified. But you forget that relationships are based on shared experiences. They're not based on looking at a phone together or texting. Shared experiences and shared learning is so incredibly important. My son and I, we lifted weights together. We had metrics associated with where we wanted to be when he was a teenager. Now he had his thing. He went to karate. I was not a martial artist. But when he went to karate, I would do other things in the gym. So there needs to be, and providing your child with that outlet to explore their own experiences. I'll give you an example of that is Jordan played flag football from age 5 to probably 12. I thought for sure he was going to play high school football just like me. When he was 12, he decided, I really don't want to go that route. I would much rather go into martial arts. I celebrated that. I wasn't going to force him into something that, that for my ego that he would be involved in, gave him his own outlet. But at the same time, even though I didn't do martial arts, we still did a lot of activities together. And I think that is a missing link in a lot of families right now is, how many families eat at the table together nowadays? Many are eating in front of the TV and it's easier. But I also believe that not eating around the table is a time that brings your family together. It brings our family together to talk about your day. And those small conversations teach survival skills to your child. I would give you one plug only because I know we're on a podcast. My wife runs a podcast for teenagers called Parenting This Is Now, and provides so much more advice for parents than I ever could, especially with adolescents.
No, I appreciate that. Absolutely. And to follow up regarding what you just said, first of all, you've been incredible today, extremely knowledgeable, and your perspectives are great from the business standpoint, everything from what you guys are doing.
Thank you.
Now that you have the stage to close this out, what would you like to tell my audience about what you're doing there, how we can all help? If, please, put it out there.
Awesome. Well, Kids in Distress and Family Central have been in our community for a long time. We're one of the culture movers within South Florida. We impact over 20,000 children yearly through three different pillars: foster care, early childhood education, and community-based family strengthening programs. I would encourage folks out there from your podcast is that, if you've ever had the inclination to mentor a child, be that, you can be a foster parent, but you can also be a mentor for big brothers, big sisters. There's so many kids in our community that really significantly need just that statement that I made. Every child is one caring adult from being a success story. You can be that caring adult to your neighbor's kid, to your kid that's in high school. And, it's a great volunteer experience for folks. And it doesn't have to be Kids in Distress and Family Central. There's many other organizations out there where you can breathe inspiration into a child. And, many kids just need a mentor. They just need somebody they can talk to. And I would encourage folks out there to, get involved with the families of your community, because there is such a need out there.
I mean, Mark, what you're doing is so impactful, really. I mean, every single day, how you're helping society, because our children are our future. And it's really, scary things that you see that's going on today. It's a lot different than 30, 40, 50 years ago. And speaking to some people that are baby boomers today. So to have people like you and your organization, other organizations really getting involved with children and kids. And like you said before, the simplistic thing as being a mentor to them and the significant difference in their lives. And that's a tremendous message. So this is really fun. And I really enjoyed having you on very much. And thanks so much for your time. Look forward to staying in touch together as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Phil, for the wonderful conversation.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.